They called me cheap in my father's living room, laughing like it was a harmless joke. I didn't correct them. I didn't remind them that the $26,000 Dubai trip they were bragging about was my gift until they replaced me with my brother's fiancé, my chair, my money, my eraser. Outside, a faint hum grew louder, rattling the windows. The helicopter wasn't planned for show. It was my pickup for a medical relief mission. But when the rotors cut the air and faces turned toward me, I realized this wasn't about proving I wasn't poor. It was about proving I didn't need them. The hum of the helicopter faded behind me as I stepped back into my father's sprawling farmhouse. The scent of polished wood and overby brewed coffee hung in the air, wrapping the living room in a strange warmth that felt anything but welcoming. I took my seat again, folding my hands in my lap, hoping the conversation had moved on. It hadn't. Richard, my father, sat at the head of the long oak table like a judge in his courtroom. "Now," he began, voice deep and deliberate, "we need to talk about what it means to contribute as adults. Everyone here's grown. Everyone here should be doing their part." His eyes swept the table, lingering on Caleb just long enough to smile before moving on to me. I felt the weight of it, the pause, the unspoken words. Caleb, my older brother by 2 years, leaned back in his chair with the smug ease of someone who'd never once been asked to prove himself. "Especially when it comes to family events," he added, his tone light but sharp. "Some of us," his eyes cut toward me, "just aren't really the Dubai type, you know." I could feel the room tightening, the aunts, the cousins, the polite clinks of silverware trying to fill the silence. Richard didn't step in. He didn't correct him. Caleb chuckled, shaking his head like he was amused by his own wit. "Let's be honest," he said, voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear. "Morgan's always been a little cheap." The word hit harder than I expected. Not because I believed it, but because I'd heard it before, in different forms, wrapped in softer packaging. And every time my father had stayed silent, just as he did now, I glanced at him, searching for a flicker of defense, a shift in his expression. Nothing. His gaze dropped to the table, as if he just remembered something important in the grain of the wood. The laughter around the table wasn't loud, but it was enough. Enough to mark me as the punchline, to press me back into the same corner I'd occupied for decades. I remembered being 10 years old, sitting on the top step of the back porch, while my father and Evelyn, his new wife, set out the rules for what they called the new family order. Caleb got the bigger bedroom because he was older. Family trips were for core members, which somehow didn't include me if Evelyn's sister's kids were visiting. My voice never quite made it into their conversations unless it was to agree. Back then, I learned to smile and keep quiet, to hold my real thoughts like fragile things that might break if I let the wrong hands touch them. Now, decades later, the same lesson was trying to write itself again, louder, sharper, in front of more witnesses. The ache in my chest wasn't from Caleb's words. It was from the way my father's silence wrapped around them, like permission. That was the real blow. I took a sip of water, the glass cool against my palm, and let the taste of it steady me. My instinct was to correct him, to peel back the truth about who had actually paid for the Dubai trip, to force them to see the math. But I stayed still because I knew it wouldn't matter. Facts didn't bend the kind of narrative they'd been telling themselves about me for years. Instead, I let the room move on without me, let them talk about hotel upgrades and desert tours as if I weren't even there. My mind slipped away from the table, drifting back to a younger me, standing outside my own bedroom door, listening to laughter spill from the kitchen. I'd been close enough to hear my name, but far enough to know it wasn't an invitation. Here I was again, decades older, the scenery different, but the feeling identical. Only this time, something else stirred beneath it. Not just the hurt, but the slow, solid realization that I didn't have to sit at this table to have a place in my life. The conversation blurred into a low drone. Everyone speaking over one another about Dubai menus and dress codes I apparently couldn't meet. That was when another sound threaded its way into the room, soft at first, like a far-off storm. The hum deepened, rhythmic, mechanical. My ears caught it before anyone else's did. I knew that sound. I set my glass down and pushed my chair back with a calm that felt almost defiant. "Excuse me," I said, my voice level, not asking for permission. Richard glanced up briefly, brow furrowing, but said nothing. Caleb didn't even bother to pause his conversation. I walked toward the French, doors that opened onto the wide back lawn. The air outside was cooler, fresher, carrying the scent of grass and the faint tang of machine oil. Over the far tree-line, the helicopter appeared, sleek, white with red markings, its rotors slicing the sky. The thrum grew louder, vibrating in my chest as it approached. I stepped onto the lawn, heels sinking slightly into the earth. From this distance, I could see the crew inside, the co-pilot leaning forward to check our position. They circled once, then began to descend toward the designated landing zone on the Hale property, something I'd arranged earlier with the crew for efficiency. The family hadn't noticed. Why would they? They never asked about my schedule. The downdraft hit first, bending the grass in concentric waves, tugging at my hair and jacket. I squinted against the force, one hand braced on the railing. The skids touched down with precision, the engine's roar swallowing every other sound. Through the windshield, I spotted Kevin, one of our mission coordinators, grinning as he spotted me. The door swung open and he waved, shouting something I couldn't hear over the rotors. I crossed the lawn toward them, the world narrowing to the path in front of me. Each step felt like moving between worlds, one where I was the family's afterthought and one where I was respected, needed, and trusted. Kevin offered a hand to steady me as I climbed in. The scent inside was familiar metal disinfectant and the faint sweetness of packaged medical supplies. Behind the cockpit seats, I could see the gear for our test mission. Oxygen tanks, secured stretchers, the portable monitor we just received from a donor. "This isn't a show run," Kevin reminded me as I buckled in. "We're heading straight to the training site after the test loop." "I know," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. "That's why I'm here." From the open doorway, I caught sight of the house again. The French doors had opened wider. A cluster of figures stood there, hair whipping in the wind, hands shielding their faces. I could make out Caleb's frown, Richard's stillness, the way Evelyn leaned in to say something to him. The contrast was sharp. Inside, I was cheap, unfit for their curated idea of luxury. Out here, I was part of something that actually mattered, something that saved lives, that required skill and trust. Kevin closed the door, sealing out the view of them. The pilot gave a thumbs up and we lifted. The ground dropping away in a rush, the farmhouse shrank beneath us, the people outside reduced to tiny, unmoving silhouettes. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. For the first time that afternoon, I felt weightless. Not because of the altitude, but because I was leaving behind their version of me. Somewhere between the fields and the horizon, I caught my own reflection in the glass. Not poor, not cheap, not less than, just Morgan. Someone who'd built a life with meaning, even if they never saw it. And maybe that was the point. By the time I returned from the test loop, the dining room had been reset for dinner. The long oak table was dressed with fresh plates, crystal glasses, catching the warm glow of the chandelier. But the air, still thick from earlier, felt like it could shatter with the wrong word. Richard cleared his throat, the room quieting as if someone had pressed pause. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone carrying that unmistakable finality he used when there was no room for debate. "To make this Dubai trip truly about family, Brittany will be going in your place, Morgan." For a moment, I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. The clink of silverware from somewhere down the table felt unnaturally loud. "In my place?" I asked, my voice even, but inside my pulse spiked. "Yes," he said, nodding toward Brittany, who sat perfectly composed, a faint smile on her lips. "You're always so busy with work, and Brittany hasn't had the chance to be fully integrated into the family yet. This trip is the perfect opportunity." Across from me, Caleb leaned back, a self-satisfied grin spreading across his face. "It'll be good for everyone," he added, his words just shy of gloating. I kept my eyes on the water in front of me, fingers tightening around the stem of the glass. My jaw ached from holding it shut. The chandelier's light fractured in the glass, sharp and cold. I focused on that because if I looked up, I might betray exactly what I was feeling, and they didn't deserve to see that. In my pocket, my phone buzzed softly. I slid it out beneath the table, shielding the screen from view. An email notification from the travel agency glowed in the dim light. Payment received in full, $26,000. Hale Family Dubai Experience. My name was right there in the payer field alongside the date I'd wired the funds. It had been a birthday gift to my father, carefully planned for months. I'd worked with the agency to arrange every detail, the luxury hotel, the desert safari, even a private dinner cruise. Because I'd thought foolishly that shared experiences could mend old cracks. Now the gift had been reshaped, repurposed, and handed to someone else without a second thought. I tucked the phone away, my thumb brushing over the edge of the device like it could anchor me. Richard moved on discussing the itinerary with Brittany, as if the decision was a done deal, as if my absence was the most natural thing in the world. I let my gaze drift over the table, my aunts leaning in to catch every word, my cousins nodding like this was a reasonable course of action. Not one of them questioned it. Not one of them asked why the person who'd made the trip possible was suddenly unnecessary. The burn in my chest was sharper than anger. It was the familiar sting of being edited out of my own story. The same way I'd been edited out of family photos, plans, and narratives since the day Evelyn married my father, I forced myself to breathe slowly, counting the inhales and exhales like I did before stepping into a high-pressure mission briefing. This was different. This wasn't a situation I could fix with logistics, contracts, or a checklist. This was a decision rooted in something far more insidious. How they saw me, and perhaps more painfully, how they wanted me to see myself. Caleb caught my eye then, and the satisfaction there was almost too much to bear. He knew exactly what this meant. He knew it wasn't about a trip to Dubai. It was about erasing me from the center of something I'd built. I swallowed the lump in my throat, set my glass down with deliberate care, and pressed my palms flat against the table. I didn't speak, not yet. But in that silence a vow formed, a quiet, steady promise that they would not walk away from this without understanding the cost of what they'd just done. I pushed my chair back, the scrape of the legs against the hardwood cutting through the hum of conversation. No one looked up, not really, except Brittany, who tracked me with the kind of curiosity a cat reserves for a cornered bird. In the hallway, away from the table's oppressive glow, the air felt lighter. I slipped my phone from my pocket and scrolled to the number for the travel agency. The call connected on the second ring. "This is Lydia from Premier Horizons." A bright voice answered. "How can I help you today, Miss Hale?" I stepped into the study, closing the door behind me. "Hi, Lydia. I'm calling about the Hale Family Dubai Experience confirmation number 4719. I need to discuss a change." There was the soft clatter of a keyboard. "Yes, I see the booking here. Fully paid by wire transfer last month. Is there an issue?" "Not exactly an issue," I said, keeping my voice calm. "A change of plans. I understand there's a clause for substitutions or reconfigurations up to 30 days before departure." "That's correct," Lydia replied. "All tickets and accommodations can be reassigned or exchanged for equivalent value before that deadline. You're well within the window." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "Good. Then here's what I'd like to do." As she pulled up the relevant forms, a plan began to crystallize. Not revenge, not some dramatic scene to teach them a lesson, but a quiet reclamation of my own gift. I wasn't going to bankroll my own exclusion. "I'd like to cancel the group itinerary as it stands," I told her. "Instead, I want to rebook a separate experience for two, my father and myself. Something domestic, scenic, tied to a place my mother loved." There was a pause on the line, the kind people make when they realize they're stepping into something personal. "Of course," Lydia said softly. "Do you have a destination in mind?" I did. A lakeside lodge in Vermont where my parents had spent one of their last happy summers together before illness, and remarriage reshaped everything. I'd found the place in an old photo album years ago and had always meant to take my father back. Within minutes, we had it mapped out. A week-long stay, private cabin, guided hikes, a dinner cruise on the lake. Everything my father had once loved stripped of the ostentation that now seemed to define his choices. Lydia confirmed the transfers, the credits, the zero balance. All set, she said. You'll receive updated itineraries and confirmations by email within the hour. Thank you, I said, meaning it. When I ended the call, I stood for a moment in the quiet study, letting the decision settle in. The satisfaction I felt wasn't sharp. It was steady, grounded. I hadn't taken anything from them they were entitled to. I'd simply reclaimed what was mine to give. I opened my email, watching the confirmations arrive, the old booking vanish from my records. In its place, the Vermont Lodge, the dates, the activities. This was no longer about proving my worth to them. It was about honoring what mattered to me, even if they never understood it. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and returned to the dining room. The conversation was still spinning around Dubai, Brittany laughing, Caleb talking over her, my father nodding along. No one noticed my return, and that was fine. I took my seat without a word, hands steady now, my gaze clear. They thought they'd taken something from me. They hadn't realized I'd just taken it back. The sound of Brittany's laughter faded into the background, replaced by the low hum of my own thoughts. I'd gotten good at compartmentalizing, at boxing up the hurt until I could deal with it later. But sometimes those boxes broke open on their own. Tonight was one of those times. The smell of polished wood and coffee in this house always took me back. Not to good memories, but to the ones that stuck like burrs. I was 12 when my mother's funeral filled these same rooms with people and flowers and polite phrases. I remember the way the air felt heavy, the kind of heavy that makes breathing an effort. Everyone wore black except for Caleb, who refused because it's boring. He got away with it, of course. Richard stood near the casket most of the afternoon, shaking hands, thanking people for coming. He didn't cry, not once, not in public, not in private. I remember trying to catch his eye once to see if there was anything in there, grief, pain, something. But his gaze slipped past me like I wasn't part of the equation. Caleb, 2 years older, was shepherded around by relatives, told how brave and strong he was. They called him the man of the house now. Even though I was the one who learned how to pay the bills and cook for both of us when the fridge was empty. Those first few months were a blur of castles, whispered condolences, and the quiet rearranging of our lives. Richard buried himself in work. Caleb buried himself in sports and friends. I buried myself in surviving. When Evelyn entered the picture less than a year later, the tone of the house shifted overnight. She had a smile that could slice if you looked too closely, and a knack for making everything about presentation. Caleb was her instant favourite, the one she dressed for parties, praised at dinners, bragged about to her bridge club. I learned quickly that my best survival strategy was to make myself small, to keep my head down and my grades up. But making yourself small comes at a cost. By the time I was 22, I'd left for good. I built a life on my own terms, starting a logistics startup out of a cramped apartment with a view of a brick wall. The hours were brutal, the learning curve steep, but for the first time I was in control of something that mattered to me. 7 years later, I sold that company for enough to never have to work again if I didn't want to. But I did want to. Money wasn't the point. It never had been. The point was purpose. And purpose came in the form of a job offer from a non-profit air medical organization. I'd first read about them as a teenager the night my mother collapsed in the kitchen. The ambulance had taken over 40 minutes to arrive because the nearest hospital was too far and the roads were iced over. She didn't make it. I used to wonder if a helicopter would have made a difference. Now, I was part of a team that made sure other families didn't have to wonder. I coordinated missions, secured funding for equipment, worked with pilots who could land in conditions most people wouldn't dream of. Every mission was a reminder of why I'd chosen this path. It wasn't glamorous and it didn't make for flashy Instagram posts, but it was real. It was work that mattered. Sometimes, though, I wondered if Richard even knew what I did or if he cared. His questions about my job were always pre-uncta, polite, asked as if they were boxes to be checked before moving on to the real topics like Caleb's golf game or Brittany's latest promotion. Sitting at that table tonight, hearing him hand over my seat on a trip I'd planned as a gift, it struck me that maybe he'd never seen me clearly at all. The ache of that thought settled deep, not sharp like anger, but heavy, like grief. It was the same weight I'd carried since I was 12. Standing in a room full of mourers, realizing I was already invisible. I sometimes wondered what they thought kept my life running. In their eyes, I was the one who got by, who somehow managed without needing much. The truth was, I had been the one keeping more than just my own life afloat. Caleb's first credit card meltdown had happened when he was 25. He'd racked up charges for networking dinners, weekend trips, and impulsive buys. He called investments. When the collection notices started coming, he called me, not Dad, not Evelyn. Me. I wired the money the same day, paying off over $8,000 without asking for repayment. It wasn't the last time. Over the years, the amounts blurred together. 3,000 here, 5,000 there, always in the form of urgent calls or desperate emails. Each time I told myself I was doing it for family, that keeping Caleb out of financial freeall would preserve some kind of peace. Richard's calls were different. They came late at night, his voice low, as if Evelyn couldn't hear him in the next room. The first time, it was a hospital bill after a fall he'd taken on the property. Insurance had covered most of it, but the remainder still stung. I paid it without hesitation, telling myself it was the least I could do. Then there was the time he needed a temporary loan to cover a property tax shortfall, the time the roof repair ran over budget, the time Caleb's car broke down and Richard didn't want the boy saddled with debt. Every time I said yes, no one else knew. I never told the aunts or the cousins, never hinted at it during holidays. I didn't even keep a running total, though part of me wishes I had. If only to see in black and white just how much I'd poured into maintaining a version of the family that had no place for me at its center. It's strange how money can buy you space in someone's world without buying you a seat at their table. I'd thought for years that my quiet generosity was an investment in belonging, that if I helped enough, gave enough, smoothed over enough of their crises, they'd see me as indispensable. But tonight had stripped that illusion bare. They had taken the most generous gesture I'd ever made. A trip planned stances down to the last detail, paid for in full, and reassigned it without hesitation, without conversation, without a flicker of awareness that it was mine to give. I sat there feeling the cold logic of it settle in. My money had been welcome. My presence had not. That was the real twist, the one I hadn't wanted to see. I'd been funding my own exclusion for years. Every payment I'd made, every quiet bailout, had only reinforced the role they'd assigned me, useful in the background, invisible in the foreground. The realization hit harder than Caleb's smirk or Richard's silence. It was one thing to be underestimated. It was another to realize you'd been complicit in your own erasure. I thought back to the day I sold my company. I'd called Richard first, expecting, I don't know, maybe pride, maybe congratulations. What I got was a distracted, "That's nice, honey," followed by a request to help Caleb with a down payment on a condo. I'd agreed because saying no felt like cutting the last thread, tying me to them. Now I understood that thread had been a leash, and I'd been holding the other end the whole time. In the dining room, laughter erupted over something Brittany had said. I looked at them, at the easy way they moved around each other, and realized they would never see what I'd done for them. Not because they couldn't, but because they didn't have to. And maybe, finally, I didn't have to either. The first ripple hit less than 24 hours after I'd called the travel agency. I was in my kitchen the next morning making coffee when my phone lit up with a cascade of notifications. The family group chat, usually a stream of birthday reminders and forwarded memes, was now a battlefield. Brittany had struck first. Her message was long, peppered with faux innocent phrases like, "I just don't understand why," and seems a little petty, doesn't it? She had written as though she was speaking to a jury, carefully crafting her words so that anyone skimming would come away with one conclusion. I had sabotaged a family trip out of spite. I scrolled, skimming the chorus of replies. Aunts chimed in with, "That's such a shame." And, "We were so looking forward to having you there, Brittany. No one asked for my side. No one even tagged me." The thread had the surreal quality of a play, where everyone is speaking as if you're not in the room, even though your name is in the script. By mid-morning, Caleb called. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but picked up on the third ring. "What the hell, Morgan?" His voice was sharp, more performative than truly angry. "Do you have any idea how bad this makes Dad look? He's already getting questions from his friends about why the itinerary got cancelled." I took a slow sip of coffee. "It wasn't cancelled, it was changed. That's semantics," he snapped. "Everyone knows you pulled the rug out. You made him look like he doesn't have control of his own family." I almost laughed at that. Control had never been the problem. How he used it had. I didn't do anything to make him look that way. I said he made a decision. I made mine. "You've always had to be difficult, haven't you?" Caleb's voice dropped into that condescending register he used when we were kids. Couldn't just let things go for once. Couldn't just be part of the team. Part of the team. The phrase landed like a stone. I thought about every check I'd written, every late-night bailout, every time I'd swallowed my pride to keep the peace. If that was being part of the team, I was done playing. "I think we're done here," I said, and hung up before he could respond. The phone rang again, almost immediately, but I let it go. A few minutes later, a text popped up from Aunt Linda. It was short, just one line. "Good for you." I stared at it longer than I should have, the 2 in of screen carrying more warmth than anything else that day. Linda had always been the quiet observer at family gatherings, the one who saw more than she said. She never inserted herself into the politics of the house, but she'd pull me aside after dinners to ask how work was going or to slip me a book she thought I'd like. I typed back, "Thanks." It didn't feel like enough, but I knew she'd understand. The rest of the day unfolded in waves. Pinging notifications, sidelong emails, a few cousins sliding into my messages with passive-aggressive, just checking in notes. It was a masterclass in indirect confrontation, the kind my family had perfected over decades. By evening, the pressure in my chest had built to a steady thrum. It wasn't just the accusations, it was the way they'd all lined up behind the loudest voice without pausing to ask why I'd made the choice I did. They wanted a villain, and Brittany had given them one. I stood at the window, watching the sun sink behind the trees. The sky streaked in orange and violet. There was a part of me that wanted to fire back, to drop the receipts into the chat, the payment confirmation, the contract terms, the new booking for Dad, to watch their carefully constructed narrative crumble in real time. But another part of me knew better. Sometimes silence unsettles people more than any explanation, and I had a feeling the real storm was still coming. I called Richard that evening asking if we could meet somewhere quiet. No Brittany, no Caleb, no Evelyn, just us. He suggested the back porch at the farmhouse. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting in the old wicker chair with a glass of bourbon in hand. The porch light cast long shadows across his face, making him look older, more tired than I remembered. "Thanks for coming," I said, easing into the chair opposite him. He nodded, but his gaze stayed fixed on the yard. "You've stirred up quite a mess, Morgan." "I think the mess was already there," I replied gently. "I just stopped pretending it wasn't." He sighed, swirling the bourbon in his glass. "You have to understand, it wasn't personal replacing you on the trip. It was just easier." Caleb and Brittany were excited. Saying no to them would have caused tension I didn't want to deal with. "Easier for you," I said, my voice sharper now, not for me. For the first time he met my eyes. "You've always been different, independent. You don't need us the way they do. And if I'm being honest, sometimes you overshadow the family." The words landed like a stone in my chest. Overshadow. He took a slow sip before continuing. "When we're around the extended family, those with money, influence, you stand out. You talk about things they don't understand, achievements they can't match. It makes them feel less. Caleb resents it. Brittany would too. I just wanted to avoid all that. There it was, the twist I hadn't expected. It wasn't that I wasn't enough for them, it was that I was too much." "You were worried I'd make the family look bad," I said flatly. He didn't deny it. "Appearances matter, Morgan. You might not care, but other people do." I leaned back, the night air cool against my skin. For a moment, I didn't know whether to laugh or walk away. "You think I spend my life working for a medical non-profit because I care about impressing rich strangers?" His jaw tightened. "I think you underestimate how these things work." "No," I said quietly, "I think you underestimate me." Silence settled between us, thick as the summer air. In the distance, a cicada droned. Finally, I said, "Come with me to the airbase tomorrow. See what I do. See why I do it. No donors, no press, just the work. If you still think I'm trying to overshadow anyone after that, I won't bring it up again." He hesitated, turning the idea over in his mind. "Why?" "Because I think you've been looking at me through someone else's filter for a long time," I said, "and I'd like you to see me for yourself." He studied me for a long moment, before nodding once. "All right, tomorrow morning." I stood, the chair creaking behind me. "I'll pick you up at 9. As I walked back to my car, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Hope. Not a naive hope that one conversation could undo years of distance, but a small, steady ember that maybe, just maybe, he could see past the stories he'd been told. It wasn't about Dubai anymore. It wasn't even about the trip I'd reclaimed. It was about shifting the ground beneath us, even if only by an inch. And if that inch was all I could get, I was willing to fight for it. Richard was waiting on the porch when I pulled up the next morning, hands tucked into the pockets of a windbreaker. He didn't say much during the drive, just watched the farmland roll by through the passenger window. The Air 6 came into view, a collection of hangars, a control tower, and the wide-open expanse of the landing pad. As we pulled into the visitor lot, one of the ground crew waved in recognition. Inside the main hangar, the morning briefing was already underway. Pilots, medics, and logistics coordinators clustered around a large table strewn with maps and mission reports. The smell of fuel mixed with the faint antiseptic tang from the medical kits lined up against the wall. I led Richard to the edge of the group, nodding to Kevin, who immediately greeted me with a quick smile. "Morgan, perfect timing. We're running a training loop with the new cardiac monitor today. This is my father, Richard Hale," I said. "Dad, this is Kevin, one of our coordinators." Kevin shook his hand firmly. "Your daughter runs a tight ship here," he said. "Couldn't do half of what we do without her." I caught the flicker in Richard's expression. Not pride exactly, but something close. The briefing resumed, and Richard listened as the pilot outlined weather conditions, fuel reserves, and landing protocols for rural extractions. The medics discussed patient stabilization procedures, referencing cases where every second counted. When the meeting broke, I took him on a tour. We passed through the equipment bay where 2 medics were checking oxygen tanks. One of them, a woman named Tara, called out, "Morgan, we're stocked and ready. Thanks for securing the donor last month." Richard glanced at me. "Donor private grant," I said, "covered new tanks for the season." We moved on to the training area where a mannequin lay strapped to a stretcher sensors. Tracking simulated vitals. A medic demonstrated how they practiced rapid incubation under turbulence conditions. The radio crackled overhead, dispatch feeding coordinates for an incoming call. A real mission, not training. The crew moved with calm urgency, grabbing gear, confirming checklists. Richard stood back, watching as I verified flight clearance and relayed weather updates to the pilot. When the helicopter blades began their slow rotation, the sound filled the hangar, vibrating through the floor. The patient mannequin was replaced with a real person, a transfer from a rural clinic who needed specialized cardiac care. From the moment the stretcher rolled in to the moment the skids left the pad, less than 8 minutes passed. Richard didn't say a word, but his eyes followed every movement, every exchange of clipped, precise language between crew members. When the helicopter lifted into the clear morning sky, he exhaled slowly as if he'd been holding his breath. We walked back inside, the hangar quieter now. Kevin clapped me on the shoulder. Good run, smooth coordination as always. Richard's gaze lingered on me for a long moment. There was a new weight in it, as though he'd been recalibrating the numbers in his head. "This is what you do," he said finally, not a question, an acknowledgement. "This is what I do," I confirmed. We left the base just before noon. The drive back was mostly silent, but it felt different from the ride there, less guarded. As we turned onto the main road toward the farmhouse, Richard said almost to himself, "You're good at it, more than good." I didn't answer right away. I let the words settle, small and significant, before saying, "Thanks, Dad." He didn't look at me, but I could see the corner of his mouth lift just slightly. And for the first time in years, I allowed myself to think that maybe, just maybe, he was proud of me, even if he'd never said it out loud. 2 days after the visit to the airbase, I got a call from Richard. His voice was low, tight, the way it got when he just heard something he couldn't quite believe. "Can you come by?" he asked. No explanation, no small talk. When I arrived at the farmhouse, he was pacing the living room. Caleb sat on the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. Brittany was nowhere in sight. Richard didn't waste time. "I just got off the phone with the credit card company. Caleb's account is overdrawn severely." I looked at my brother. He didn't meet my eyes. "They said the charges started stacking up weeks ago," Richard continued. "Luxury spas, private dining packages, resort upgrades, all for Dubai," his tone sharpened. "None of which were covered in the original itinerary you booked," Caleb muttered. "Brittany said she'd handle it." She promised she had a plan." Richard's jaw tightened. "A plan? She used your card for everything. And when I called her just now to ask about it, He stopped, exhaling through his nose. "She hung up. Now she's not answering." The image of Brittany's perfectly composed smile at the dinner table flashed in my mind, the way she'd sat there while Richard announced she'd be taking my place. "So," I said slowly, "let me guess. Caleb can't pay it off." Caleb's shoulders sagged. "It's over 20 grand. I don't have that kind of money right now." Richard ran a hand through his hair. Frustration etched into every movement. "This isn't just about the money. It's about the fact that she's vanished." The second things got complicated. There was a long silence. I could feel the weight of it pressing in from all sides. "This," Richard said finally, "is not what I expected from her or from you, Caleb." Caleb's head snapped up. "From me? I didn't know she was doing all this." "You didn't know because you didn't want to know," Richard cut in. "You let her make decisions with your money because it was easier than saying no, and now look where you are." It was jarring seeing my father speak to Caleb with that edge in his voice. Usually he saved his criticism for me. I stayed quiet, letting the conversation run its course. There was nothing I could add that wouldn't sound like gloating, and I wasn't here for that. Richard turned to me then, and for the first time in a long while, there was no defensiveness in his gaze, just recognition. "I thought keeping you off that trip would make things smoother," he said, "but I see now it just made room for this." He gestured toward Caleb, toward the mess Brittany had left behind. I didn't respond right away. The truth was, I felt no satisfaction in being proven right. If anything, there was a hollow ache in my chest. This was the real face of the problem, the kind you couldn't solve with a single conversation or a clever rebooking. Caleb muttered something about calling the bank again, then left the room. The sound of the front door closing echoed through the hall. Richard sank into his chair. the bourbon glass from the other night now replaced with a mug of coffee. "I don't know what to do with him," he admitted quietly, "and I don't know how to fix this." For a moment, I considered offering to pay it off. Old habits die hard. But then I remembered the vow I'd made to myself to stop funding my own erasure. Instead, I said, maybe it's time he fixes it himself. You can support him without cleaning up his messes." Richard nodded slowly, as if the idea was foreign, but not unwelcome. The room fell into a silence that wasn't hostile, just heavy. We both knew this wasn't over. Brittany might have disappeared for now, but the ripples she'd caused would be felt for a long time. And maybe, just maybe, that was what it would take for Richard to see the difference between someone who stood beside you and someone who stood on you. 2 days passed before I called Richard again. I'd been mulling over what happened with Brittany, with Caleb, with all of it. The old me would have stepped in by now, wired money, made calls, patched things up, so no one had to feel the consequences too sharply. But that was the old me. We met at the small diner on the edge of town, the one with cracked red booze and a coffee pot that never emptied. Richard was already there, staring into a mug like he could find answers in the steam. I slid into the booth across from him. "I've been thinking," I began, "about how things have been in this family for as long as I can remember." His eyes narrowed slightly, as if bracing himself. And I realized I've been doing everyone a disservice, including myself," he set the mug down. "How so?" "By stepping in every time there's a problem," I said. "By writing checks instead of setting boundaries. By making sure everyone else is comfortable, even when it meant erasing myself from the picture." Richard didn't say anything, but his jaw worked like he was chewing over the words. "So here's what's going to change," I continued. "From now on, any help I give, financial or otherwise, will go through a family assistance fund. It'll be transparent, documented, and it won't cover luxury expenses. No trips, no designer clothes, no impulse purchases." His brows drew together. "That sounds formal." "It is," I said, "because I can't keep doing this quietly behind the scenes with no accountability. It's not helping anyone. Not really. It's just enabling bad habits and keeping certain dynamics locked in place." Richard leaned back, crossing his arms. "You're talking about Caleb." "I'm talking about all of us," I said, holding his gaze, "including you. If you need something, medical costs, home repairs, emergency expenses, I'll help. But I'm done funding anything that's about appearances or status. I've seen where that leads." He exhaled slowly, the lines around his mouth deepening. "You think I'm going to like this?" "I think you're going to understand it," I replied, eventually. For a long moment, the only sound was the clink of dishes from the kitchen. Finally, Richard nodded once, short and reluctant. "You're not wrong. I just don't like how it makes me feel." "How does it make you feel?" I asked. "Like I've been leaning on you without even realizing it," he admitted. "And like I've let Caleb do the same, maybe more than the same." "That's exactly why it needs to change." I said, if the roles were reversed, if I'd been the one racking up debt and making reckless choices, you would have sat me down years ago. This is me sitting us all down. A waitress stopped by to refill our coffees. Richard thanked her quietly, then turned back to me. "You've been carrying more than I thought," he said. "I've been carrying more than you ever saw," I corrected gently. "And I'm not angry about that. Not anymore. But I am done pretending it doesn't take a toll." His gaze softened just a fraction. "So this fund, how would it work?" I pulled a folder from my bag and slid it across the table. Inside was a simple outline. Contributions from me, guidelines for what expenses could be covered, and a requirement that all withdrawals be approved jointly by at least 2 family members. Richard flipped through it, his frown easing into something more thoughtful. "You've really thought this through." "I've had a lot of practice thinking about how to make things run smoothly," I said, a small smile tugging at my lips. "This time I'm applying it to us," he tapped the folder. "Caleb's not going to like it." "I'm aware," I said, "but maybe that's what he needs." a reason to make better choices, a reason to stand on his own. Richard nodded slowly, as if the idea was settling into place. "All right," he said at last, "let's try it your way." It wasn't an enthusiastic endorsement, but it was acceptance. And that was enough for now. We finished our coffee mostly in silence, but it wasn't the brittle quiet we'd shared in the past. This felt measured, tentative, like the start of something that might actually hold. As we stood to leave, Richard hesitated. "Morgan," he said, his voice low, "I know I haven't said this enough, or maybe at all, but I do appreciate what you've done for this family, even if I didn't always show it." The words landed softly, but they carried weight. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it. Walking out into the crisp afternoon air, I felt the faint stir of relief. Not because everything was fixed, it wasn't, but because for the first time there were terms. Clear, solid terms. And maybe that was the real beginning. Caleb showed up at my apartment 3 days later, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. His usual easy grin was gone, replaced by something raw and unsteady. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside, and he walked straight to the couch, sitting heavily. For a long moment, he just stared at his hands. "I'm sorry," he said finally, "for the trip, for letting Brittany do what she did, for not stopping it." The words felt strange in the air. Caleb wasn't someone who apologized easily. "I can't undo it," he continued, "but I can fix my own mess. I talked to the bank. I'm consolidating the debt, setting up a repayment plan. I'm selling the jet ski, the watch, everything I bought that I didn't need." I studied him for a moment, looking for the cracks that might reveal this was just another performance, but his shoulders were slumped, his voice low, not defensive, just tired. "That's good," I said. "It's a start," he nodded. I think I need to start managing my money differently. I've been coasting because I knew someone, usually you, would catch me. I don't want to live like that anymore." It wasn't absolution, but it was accountability. And for the first time, I believed he meant it. After he left, I found an envelope slipped under my door. My name was written in my father's handwriting, the loops and slants instantly recognizable. I carried it to the kitchen table, hesitating before opening it. "Morgan, I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the diner, about boundaries, about the years between us. I need to tell you something I should have told you a long time ago. When your mother died, I didn't know how to be a father to you. I buried myself in work because it was easier than facing what we'd lost. I let Caleb take up all the space because it kept me from having to see how much space you'd been pushed out of. I thought you were strong enough not to need me. I see now that I was wrong. I let you carry more than your share. I let you become the person who solved problems without ever asking if you should have to. And in doing that, I left you alone. I am sorry for that. I am sorry for every time I didn't defend you, for every silence that told you you weren't worth speaking up for. I don't expect you to forgive me all at once, but I want you to know I see you now, not for what you've done for this family, but for who you are." "Dad," I read it twice, the words blurring near the end. My father's apologies had always been implicit, buried in gestures or quiet changes in behavior. This was the first time they'd been written down, made tangible. I folded the letter carefully, not because I forgave everything in an instant, but because it was something I wanted to keep, a marker that the ground between us had shifted. That evening I called him. "I got your letter," I said. There was a pause, and I appreciate it. I said it's a start. The quiet on the line wasn't uncomfortable this time. It felt like the space between us was no longer a void, but a bridge. Still narrow, still fragile, but there. We didn't talk long. We didn't need to. Some things didn't have to be filled with words to mean something. For the first time in years, I hung up the phone and didn't feel the weight of everything unsaid. Instead, I felt the faint lift of something I hadn't let myself hope for. Maybe this was what reconciliation could look like. Not perfect, not instant, but real. The Hale family gathered in the farmhouse dining room on a Friday evening, the same room where so many of our worst arguments had happened. But this time, it felt different. There was no printed itinerary on the table, no talk of resorts or upgrades, no one calculating who was in and who was out. The table was set simply: white plates, mismatched wine glasses, and a casserole that Aunt Linda had baked herself. A loaf of bread sat on a cutting board, still warm from the oven. There was even a salad, though I suspected it was more for show than for anyone's appetite. Caleb was there, quieter than usual. He passed the bread without trying to dominate the conversation. Aunt Linda chatted about her garden, and a cousin told a story about getting lost on a hiking trail. The undercurrent of tension I'd grown used to wasn't gone entirely, but it had faded enough that I could take a full breath without feeling it catch. Richard sat at the head of the table, as always, but instead of launching into announcements or directives, he asked a question. "Morgan," he said, and I noticed how the room went still for half a beat. "What was your mother like before I met her?" The words caught me off guard. No one in this house had asked me that in years. Not seriously, not without an agenda. I set down my fork. "She was funny," I began. "She had this way of making even the most ordinary things feel like events. She'd turn Tuesday night dinners into picnics on the living room floor just because she thought the couch looked lonely. She loved music, old jazz records mostly, and she was stubborn in the best way. If she decided she could do something, she'd find a way." Richard listened, his hands folded loosely in front of him. "I remember she loved the lake," he said after a moment. "She did," I replied. "She said it was the only place she could think without feeling like the world was pressing in." Aunt Linda smiled faintly. She used to drag me there even when it was freezing, said the cold made the water bluer. The conversation meandered from there. Stories about her cooking, about the time she tried to build a treehouse in the backyard and nearly broke a ladder, about how she once convinced the whole neighborhood to plant sunflowers in their front yards. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like an outsider listening to someone else's family talk. These were my stories too, and tonight they were welcome at the table. At one point, Richard asked, "Do you think she'd be proud of you?" I didn't have to think about it. "Yes," I said, "not because of the things I've done, but because I'm still here, because I didn't let the worst parts of what happened define me." He nodded, and there was something in his eyes, regret maybe, or gratitude, that made me look away before I could read too much into it. Dinner went on, the conversation lighter now, the air warmer. Caleb even cracked a joke that made me laugh, and for once it didn't feel like a truce, balanced on the edge of a knife. When the plates were cleared and the coffee poured, Richard spoke again. "I was thinking maybe we should all take a trip to the lake this summer, just the family. No big plans, no luxury nonsense, just us." It wasn't an apology, but it was a gesture. And for the first time, I believed it might come from a genuine place. I glanced around the table, the mismatched glasses, the uneven slices of bread, the people who had been both my sharpest critics and in rare moments my allies. For all the years I'd spent trying to earn my seat here, I realized now that the seat itself had never been the prize. The prize was being able to sit here without needing their validation to know I belonged to myself. We left early on a Sunday, the sun still low and the roads quiet. Richard insisted on driving, and I let him, even though I knew the way by heart. The lake wasn't far, just under 2 hours, but the silence between us made it feel longer. Not a strange silence this time, more like the kind that leaves space for things to settle. When we pulled into the small gravel lot, the air was cool and smelled faintly of pine. The water stretched out in front of us, still and glassy, reflecting the pale blue of the morning sky. It looked exactly like it had in the photographs of my mother. Her hair wind-blown, her eyes squinting against the sunlight. We walked down to the shore without speaking. The dock creaked under our weight, the sound carrying across the water. I sat at the edge, letting my feet dangle just above the surface. Richard lowered himself onto the boards beside me slower than he used to. "She loved it here," he said after a while. I know, I replied. She used to say it was the one place where the world felt big enough for her thoughts. He smiled faintly, eyes on the water. I didn't get it then. I think I do now. For a long stretch, we just sat there, the only sounds, the soft lap of water against the dock and the occasional call of a bird overhead. I could feel the years between us, years of missed conversations, of unasked questions settling into the quiet. Eventually, I said, Dad, I've spent a lot of my life trying to keep a seat at your table, trying to prove I deserved to be there. He didn't interrupt, which in itself felt like progress. But I've realized, I continued, I don't need a seat at every table. I just need to be where I'm respected, where I'm not afraid someone's going to pull the chair out from under me. He nodded slowly, still looking out at the horizon. I can't change the years we lost, he said, but I can try to make sure the ones ahead are better. I believed him, not because the words were perfect, but because they felt like they'd cost him something to say. We stayed there until the sun climbed higher, warming the boards beneath us. Richard told me a story I'd never heard before about the first time he brought my mother here. How they'd gotten caught in a sudden downpour and ended up taking shelter in a tiny bait shop, drinking bad coffee and talking for hours. I think that's when I knew, he said quietly, that she was it for me. There was a softness in his voice I hadn't heard in decades. When it was time to go, we walked back to the car at an easy pace. I took one last look at the lake, memorizing the way the light hit the water, the way the trees framed the shore. On the drive back, Richard asked if we could stop for lunch. We found a small roadside diner, the kind with peeling linoleum and pie specials, written on a chalkboard. Over sandwiches and coffee, the conversation drifted to lighter things. My work schedule, his plans for the property, a book Aunt Linda had recommended. It wasn't a grand reconciliation. It wasn't a sweeping declaration that all was forgiven, but it was steady, real. As we pulled into my driveway, Richard rested his hands on the steering wheel for a moment before turning to me. I'm glad we did this, he said. Me too, I replied, and I meant it. When I stepped out of the car, the air felt different, cooler, lighter. I realized then that the ache I'd carried for so long had shifted. It was still there, but it no longer felt like it was running the show. Some losses never stop echoing. But if you're lucky, you find a way to let the echoes become part of the landscape instead of the soundtrack. And maybe that's what this was. Not erasing the past, but finding a place where it could sit quietly without crowding out everything else. I watched Richard drive away, then went inside, closing the door behind me. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to brace myself for the next blow. I didn't need a seat at every table.